Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Acmeism. Acmeism was a short-lived but extremely important and influential literary movement in early 20th century Russia. And it's one of the few movements that was truly Russian. Unlike symbolism and futurism, it was not brought in from the West. It was created in Russia by Russian poets for Russian poets. And the picture on the slide here is of two of its most important writers, Nikolai Gumlioff, there on the left, and his wife Anna Akhmatova, and their son there in the middle, Lev. Acmeism arose around 1910-1912 in St. Petersburg. A group of up-and-coming young artists, especially poets, it was primarily a movement of poets for poetry, had started to rebel against symbolism. And these poets formed a guild of poets, Tsakh Poetov, in which they wanted to return what they saw as craftsmanship. They were very interested in the craft of writing and wanted to return to this idea of a guild that focused on craft. So they created this guild of poets that met regularly at the Brodyachaya Sabaka, the stray dog cafe in St. Petersburg. And they saw symbolism as too Dionysian. If you remember, we talked about the two trends in Russian literature, Dionysian and Apollonian. They saw symbolism as Dionysian, and they wanted to create the opposite of that. They wanted to create an Apollonian literary movement. And you can see their interest in classical culture, and particularly in the Apollonian side of it, in the name of their journal Apollon, or Apollo. On December 19th, 1912, at the Stray Dog Cafe, they, by which I mean primarily their two leaders, Nikolai Gumlioff, whose picture is there on the left, and Sergei Gorodetsky, announced their program of what they decided to call Acmeism or Atomism. And as I said, Nikolai Gumlioff and Sergei Gorodetsky were sort of the ideological founders of the movement. And they were also poets, and they wrote a fair amount of Acmeist poetry. But its most important poets, the poets who became most well known for writing Acmeist poetry, were Anna Akhmatova, Gumilioff's wife, and Osip Mandelstam. Here on this third slide, you can see a picture of Gorodetsky there on the left, the other main theorist of atomism or Acmeism. And these names, Acmeism, and Acmeism was the more common name, but it also is sometimes called atomism, represented their striving towards that which was best, the acme, and a return to the original meanings of words, sort of this return to atom, the atom of the language. And they were specifically rebelling against the ideals of symbolism and the style of symbolism, which, if you remember, wanted to evoke feeling. Words in symbolism were treated not as words, but were treated as gateways towards a certain feeling or gateways towards a higher state of consciousness. Symbolism was this kind of drugged out movement in which poetry and words were treated as a form of drug that could open your mind. In contrast, the Acmeists wanted to treat words as words. They were primarily interested in clarity, and the poem should say exactly what it means, and you should understand it as it is intended to be understood, and not as a gateway to an altered state of consciousness. Compactness, so they tried to use short, simple phrases instead of complex or complicated or flowery phrases. Concreteness, so they wanted to give concrete real-world examples of what they were talking about. And this is related to what they called veshchestvennost, which we might call thingness or materiality. They were really interested in depicting the material world as it is. And of course, this depiction of the material world was used to evoke a mood, but they were depicting the material world in order to depict the material world. When Mandelstam wrote about various cathedrals and other architectural features, he was writing about them as they were and not as symbols of something else, although, of course, they also have this symbolic aspect in his poetry. They were also interested in high and or classical culture. So this was a very high culture movement, which is interesting if you think about the fact that it was focused on materiality and the representation of things as they were. But they were interested in representing these very sort of high culture things like, Mandelstam's cathedrals. They had this yearning for high world culture. And so all of them were interested in culture outside of Russia. It's interesting that this was the purely Russian movement created in Russia by Russian poets for Russian poets. All the Acmeists were Russian, and they wrote a lot about non-Russian things. So Gumilyov was very interested in Africa, for example, and he traveled to Africa. He has a number of wonderful pictures of Africa in the early 20th century, and he frequently wrote about Africa in his poems. Likewise, Mandelstam was very interested in Europe, and as we'll see, he has poems about things like Notre Dame. And he also wrote about the Hagia Sophia, the cathedral in Istanbul or Constantinople. And so they were interested in life outside of Russia and depicting world culture as opposed to specifically Russian culture. They were for want of a better word, they were westernizers, although that doesn't really capture what they were. They were more cosmopolitan members of world culture who were trying to create a branch of high world culture. And perhaps an important part of that was that this was a Petersburg-centered movement. The Brodyachaya Sabaka, the Stray Dog Cafe, was in St. Petersburg, and most of the writers who ascribed to the Acmeist program were from St. Petersburg. And this opposes them to symbolism and futurism, which were more Moscow-centered movements. Symbolism and futurism were also much broader movements. Of course, they originated outside of Russia and then spread all over Russia. So we can't really say that they were exactly Moscow movements, but they were much more Moscow-centered than Acmeism, which was a specifically Petersburg-centered movement. And this contrast between Apollonian Petersburg and Dionysian Moscow is one that we see repeated again and again in Russian culture. So Acmeism, as an Apollonian Petersburg movement, is part of this broader trend in Russian culture. And as I mentioned, Mandelstam and Akhmatova were its two main poets who achieved fame for their poetry. And the most exemplary example, for want of a better phrase, of Acmeist writing is considered to be Mandelstam's 1912 collection Kamen, or Stone, and we will read a selection of poems from it. Unfortunately, Acmeism was a very short-lived movement. Of course, like any movement, it would have died out in the end in any case, but it was unfortunately cut short and not allowed to grow and flourish as it might have otherwise, which is sad in and of itself. It's always sad when an artistic movement is not allowed to flourish as it would, but it's particularly sad in this case because of the tremendous talent of some of its participants and the way in which it was literally killed off. So Nikolai Gumlioff, and we see a picture of him, a painted portrait of him there on the left on the slide against an African background. Like I said, he loved Africa and spent a lot of time there. Nikolai Gumlioff tragically was executed in 1921 for his anti-Bolshevik views. Because Akhmatova had been married to him, they were already divorced at the time, but because of her association with him, she was then basically blacklisted and prevented from publishing, thus silencing the voice of one of Russia's most wonderful poets of the 20th century. And so Acmeism overall lasted less than 10 years, but was one of the most important and influential literary movements in 20th century Russian history.